was only 23 when Florida witnessed a crime so brutal it would leave investigators speechless. A quiet park, a sunny afternoon, and a kind-hearted woman on her lunch break. What could possibly go wrong? But behind the calm Miami breeze lurked a predator. His name was Michael Tanzi, a young man whose twisted mind would turn a peaceful moment into a nightmare of terror. When police discovered what he had done, they uncovered a chain of cruelty so disturbing, it shocked even seasoned detectives. Who was this man? What drove him to commit such evil? And was Janet Acosta truly his only victim? This is the story of Michael Tanzi, the man some call a fledgling serial killer. If you're fascinated by real-life crime stories, please don't forget to like, share, comment, and subscribe. Your support helps us keep uncovering the darkest crimes in America's history. It was a bright, humid Tuesday afternoon in Miami, Florida, the kind of day when the sun shimmered across Biscayne Bay and the city hummed with life. Janet Acosta, a 49-year-old production worker at the Miami Herald, had taken her lunch break near the serene Japanese rock garden on Watson Island, a peaceful place where she often went to clear her mind. She was a gentle, soft-spoken woman, well-liked by her coworkers, devoted to her family, and known for her kindness. That day, she sat quietly inside her blue van, reading a book with the windows cracked, unaware that somewhere nearby, a stranger's eyes were fixed on her every move. That stranger was Michael Anthony Tanzi, just 23 years old, a young man drifting aimlessly through life, with a long trail of petty crimes, drug abuse, and violent impulses behind him. He was restless, angry, and unstable, a ticking time bomb. As Janet sat in her van, Tanzi walked toward her, pretending to ask for a cigarette and the time. What followed was a moment that would forever change Florida's true crime history. Without warning, he lunged at her, punching her repeatedly in the face and forcing his way into the van. He threatened her with a razor blade, ordering her to stay quiet or die. The peaceful midday silence of Watson Island was shattered in an instant. Over the next several agonizing hours, Janet Acosta endured a nightmare no one could imagine. Tanzi bound her hands, gagged her mouth, and drove her van away from Miami, heading south toward the Florida Keys. Along the way, he stopped at an ATM and forced Janet, terrified and bleeding, to withdraw money from her bank account. Investigators would later confirm she complied, hoping to survive long enough to escape. But Tanzi had no intention of letting her go. Somewhere near Cudjoe Key, surrounded by mangroves and the stillness of the ocean breeze, he dragged her out of the van and strangled her with his hands, ending the life of a woman whose only mistake was showing a moment of kindness to a stranger. Hours later, Tanzi abandoned her body in a secluded area of brush near Cudjoe Key, hidden among the mangroves and coastal undergrowth. He drove off in her van toward Key West, where he would later be spotted by police. The van, once a symbol of Janet's quiet daily routine, had become the vehicle of her murder. 4 days, her family waited anxiously for news, unaware that she would never come home again. What began as an ordinary lunch break had turned into one of Florida's most shocking and senseless murders, setting off a manhunt and an investigation that would expose the monstrous nature of Michael Tanzi, a young man whose violence was only beginning to surface. When Janet Acosta didn't return home that evening, her family immediately knew something was wrong. It wasn't like her to be late, let alone vanish without a word. Hours turned into panic as her husband reported her missing, and Miami police began what they initially thought would be a routine search. But when officers found her van missing from its usual parking spot on Watson Island, their worry deepened. By the next day, law enforcement had mobilized across South Florida, scanning surveillance footage, interviewing coworkers, and alerting stations along U.S. Highway 1, the long, winding road that connects Miami to the Florida Keys. Their break came when a patrol officer in Key West spotted a blue van matching the description of Janet's vehicle, parked haphazardly near a local gas station. The man behind the wheel looked disheveled, nervous, and out of place, a young drifter who didn't fit in with the calm tourist crowd. When officers ran the plate number, the system flagged it immediately. Within minutes, they swarmed the area, surrounding the van. Inside was Michael Anthony Tanzi, exhausted, dirty, and eerily calm. The arrest was quick, but what came after would shake investigators to their core. Once in custody, Tanzi waived his right to an attorney and began talking, almost eagerly. What poured out over the next several hours was a harrowing, emotionless confession. He recounted how he had approached Janet Acosta on Watson Island, struck her repeatedly, bound her, gagged her, and forced her to drive south while he held a razor to her throat. Detectives described his tone as flat, detached, as if he were describing a movie rather than a real woman's final hours. He told them where he had taken her, where he'd forced her to withdraw money, and how, after she pleaded for her life, he had strangled her near Kajoki. Without hesitation, he agreed to lead police to the location. When officers arrived at the site he described, a remote area of tangled brush and mangroves, they found Janet's body exactly where he said it would be. The peaceful coastal wind carried a heavy silence as detectives stood over the scene, the reality of her fate settling in. Tanzi showed no emotion, no remorse. He simply watched as they recovered her body. One detective later said it was the coldest confession he'd ever heard, a display of calculated evil in human form. But what unsettled the investigators most wasn't just the details of Janet's murder, it was what Tanzi said next. During further questioning, he made cryptic comments suggesting that Janet might not have been his only victim. He spoke vaguely about other women, about nights he couldn't remember clearly, and about a woman named Caroline in another state. Those words sent a wave of unease through the room. Could they be dealing with a serial predator just beginning his descent into darkness? Police immediately began cross-referencing unsolved cases along the Florida coast and beyond, trying to verify his claims. Whether Tanzi was boasting, deflecting, or telling the truth, no one could be sure. But one thing was clear: the man sitting in that interrogation room was far more dangerous than anyone had realized. His confession was not just an admission of guilt, it was a window into a disturbed, remorseless mind capable of anything. As detectives pressed deeper into Michael Tanzi's interrogation, the room took on an uneasy silence. What began as a routine questioning about the brutal murder of Janet Acosta turned into something far darker, a glimpse into a pattern that might stretch far beyond Florida. Between long pauses and unsettling bursts of confession, Tanzi began to speak about another woman. Her name, he said, was Caroline D. Holder. She was 37 years old, a laundromat worker living in Brockton, Massachusetts. He spoke of her casually, as if recalling a memory that didn't quite belong to him, his voice cold, detached, almost curious. Detectives leaned in, unsure whether they were hearing a desperate fabrication or a second horrifying truth. Caroline Holder had been found dead months before, in 1999, under mysterious circumstances. She was a quiet, hardworking woman who kept mostly to herself, and her murder had baffled Massachusetts authorities at the time. The case had gone cold, no suspects, no arrests, no clear motive. Now, sitting in a Florida interrogation room hundreds of miles away, Michael Tanzi was claiming responsibility. He described details that caught investigators' attention: the location, the approximate time of her death, and the way he said he left her where no one would look twice. His words sent chills down the spines of those listening. Could it be possible that the same man who murdered Janet Acosta had killed before? When word reached Massachusetts, authorities reopened the old files and began comparing Tanzi's statements to the evidence in the Caroline Holder case. For weeks, detectives combed through reports, autopsy findings, and witness interviews, hoping to find a thread that tied him to her death. But every lead unraveled. There was no physical evidence, no fingerprints, no DNA, no fibers, nothing linking Tanzi to Brockton beyond his chilling confession. It was as if the story existed only in his mind, a confession without a crime scene that could prove it. Still, investigators couldn't ignore the precision in some of the details he mentioned, things that hadn't been released publicly. Florida prosecutors, focused on securing justice for Janet Acosta, decided not to delay their case for the sake of an out-of-state investigation. Tanzi's defense team argued that he was unstable, possibly inventing stories for attention, while others believed he might have been revealing a hidden truth, the early signs of a serial killer in the making. Massachusetts authorities ultimately declined to prosecute, reasoning that Tanzi was already facing a death sentence in Florida and that pursuing another trial would not change his fate. Still, Caroline Holder's name lingered in the background of Tanzi's case, a haunting echo of violence that might never be fully explained. Her family, long left without closure, was forced to live with the uncertainty. Was her killer already punished, or was her truth lost forever? To this day, the murder of Caroline D. Holder remains officially unsolved, but her name continues to shadow Michael Tanzi's legacy. Whether it was a real confession or a manipulative lie, it cemented his reputation as a man capable of unspeakable cruelty, a predator whose darkness reached further than anyone had imagined. By the time Michael Anthony Tanzi stood before a Florida courtroom in 2003, the story of Janet Acosta's murder had already become one of the most disturbing cases in Miami's history. The courtroom was tense, filled with reporters, grieving family members, and jurors who would soon decide whether Tanzi would live or die. Over the months that followed his arrest, investigators built an airtight case, one supported by forensic evidence, ATM footage, and Tanzi's own confession. There was no question of guilt. The only question that remained was what punishment could possibly fit a crime so savage, so cold, and so deliberate. In February 2003, Tanzi pleaded guilty to charges of first-degree murder, kidnapping, robbery, and sexual battery. His demeanor in court was eerily calm. He showed little emotion as the prosecution recounted, in excruciating detail, how Janet had been beaten, bound, and strangled after hours of terror. The jurors listened in silence as photographs, police reports, and Tanzi's taped confession were presented. The evidence was overwhelming, a complete picture of calculated cruelty. When the jury returned their recommendation, it was unanimous: death. During the sentencing phase, Tanzi's defense team tried to humanize him, painting a grim portrait of a life marked by tragedy and abuse. They described a childhood riddled with neglect, sexual abuse, drug exposure, and emotional instability. Psychologists testified that Tanzi had long suffered from mental illness, post-traumatic stress, and violent tendencies rooted in years of trauma. His lawyers argued that he was a broken man, not beyond redemption, and that his actions were the product of a tortured mind rather than pure evil. They begged the court to consider mercy, a sentence of life imprisonment instead of execution. But the prosecution countered with unflinching determination. They reminded the court of Janet Acosta, her innocence, her fear, and the brutality she endured. They described how Tanzi had planned, controlled, and executed every step of his crime, showing no remorse until after his capture. To them, his childhood could not erase the horror of what he had done. Prosecutors called his actions the very definition of premeditated evil, arguing that society had a duty to ensure he could never harm another soul again. When the judge finally delivered the sentence, the courtroom fell silent. The verdict was death, a sentence of lethal injection at Florida State Prison. The judge's words were sharp, deliberate, and final. He described Tanzi's crime as one of cruel, cold-blooded premeditation, a calculated act that stripped another human being of her dignity and life. As the gavel struck, Tanzi's fate was sealed. For Janet Acosta's family, the sentence offered a small measure of justice, but no relief from the grief that lingered. For Tanzi, it marked the beginning of a long, isolated existence on death row, where every passing day would serve as a reminder of the life he had taken and the humanity he had lost. For nearly 25 years, Michael Anthony Tanzi lived behind the concrete walls of Florida State Prison, confined to the bleak isolation of death row, a place where hope faded slower than time itself. Since his arrest in April 2000, Tanzi spent almost a quarter of a century awaiting his execution, waking each morning beneath the weight of a sentence that would one day claim his life. His world shrank to a narrow cell, a steel bed, a stainless steel toilet, a flickering light bulb, and the distant echoes of other condemned men counting the days in silence. For nearly 25 years, that small cell became both his punishment and his universe. Throughout those long decades, his defense attorneys filed appeal after appeal, insisting that Tanzi's severe mental health problems, born from a childhood of abuse, neglect, and instability, should spare him from death. They portrayed him as a man shaped by trauma rather than born to evil, a disturbed, broken soul whose violent acts were symptoms of a life that had never known stability or love. Psychiatrists testified about his depression, mood swings, and suicidal tendencies, painting a picture of a man haunted by his past. Yet to the courts, the brutal murder of Janet Acosta was an act so heinous that it left no room for mercy. Each plea for clemency was rejected, each new motion dismissed. Justice, they said, had waited long enough. As time eroded his body, Tanzi grew morbidly obese and suffered from chronic back pain and sciatica that left him in near-constant agony. By early 2025, his lawyers filed a final emergency appeal, arguing that his deteriorating physical condition could lead to a botched execution, potentially causing extreme pain and violating the Eighth Amendment's ban on cruel and unusual punishment. The motion described his failing body, his difficulty breathing, his nerve pain, his inability to lie flat, as risks that could make lethal injection torturous. But the courts were unmoved. After almost 25 years of legal battles, they declared the time for justice had come. In his final days, Tanzi withdrew from the world around him. He spent quiet hours meeting with a spiritual advisor, reflecting on his life, his choices, and the irreversible harm he had caused. Prison staff described him as somber but calm, a man who had stopped resisting the inevitable. He wrote a few short letters to his attorneys and family, expressing sorrow and resignation. And when the final order arrived, there were no more motions to file, no more stays to hope for. After nearly 25 years on death row, Michael Anthony Tanzi's story reached its end. The state of Florida had waited almost a generation to carry out his sentence, and in February 2025, justice, long delayed, was finally delivered. On April 8, 2025, at exactly 6:12 p.m., the long and chilling saga of Michael Anthony Tanzi came to its final, irreversible moment. Inside the death chamber of Florida State Prison, under the watchful eyes of state officials, journalists, and family members of his victim, Tanzi, once a 23-year-old drifter whose crime had shocked Miami, was now a 48-year-old man facing the final consequence of his choices. The sterile, fluorescent-lit room was silent except for the hum of the air conditioning and the faint shuffle of guards preparing for what was about to unfold. After nearly 25 years on death row, time had caught up with him. Hours before his execution, Tanzi was served his final meal, a plate of pork chops, crispy bacon, a baked potato, and a serving of ice cream. It was simple, unceremonious, but symbolic, the last indulgence of a man whose life had been defined by violence, regret, and confinement. Witnesses said he ate slowly, quietly, barely touching most of the food. When asked if he had any final words, Tanzi looked toward the glass where Janet Acosta's family sat and offered a soft-spoken apology. "I am sorry for what I did," he said, his voice trembling. "I hope you can find peace." He then recited a Bible verse, asking God for forgiveness and strength, his tone fading into a whisper as the warden gave the final signal. At 6:09 p.m., the first of 3 lethal chemicals began to flow through the 4-line in his arm. His breathing slowed, his chest rose once, twice, then fell still. By 6:12 p.m., Michael Anthony Tanzi was pronounced dead. There were no outbursts, no protests, only the heavy silence of those witnessing the end of a man who had caused unimaginable pain. On the other side of the glass, Janet Acosta's relatives sat quietly, some holding hands, others wiping away tears, a mixture of grief, anger, and finality filling the room. Outside the prison walls, reporters waited for the official announcement. Within minutes, the Florida Department of Corrections confirmed the execution had been carried out without incident. With that, the state officially closed one of its most haunting and painful cases, a case that had begun with a random act of cruelty on a sunny Miami afternoon 25 years earlier. For the family of Janet Acosta, justice had finally been served. And for Michael Anthony Tanzi, who once described himself as a lost soul, his long road through darkness had reached its end. To this day, the murder of Janet Acosta remains one of Florida's most chilling and senseless acts of violence, a story that still sends shivers down the spine of anyone who hears it. A simple lunch break on a sunny afternoon turned into a nightmare that would scar a community and leave an entire state asking one question: why? Janet was no celebrity, no politician, just an ordinary, hardworking woman who crossed paths with a man consumed by chaos. Michael Anthony Tanzi wasn't a name anyone knew in 2000. But by the time his story ended 25 years later, it had become synonymous with cruelty, regret, and wasted life. Even after his execution, Tanzi's shadow lingers, a dark reminder of how evil often wears the mask of normalcy. His confession to another killing, that of Caroline Holder, only deepened the mystery of how far his violence may have gone. Was he truly responsible for more deaths, or was it one last act of manipulation from a mind forever lost to darkness? Those questions may never be answered. But what remains clear is this: Janet Acosta's life mattered. Her story reminds us that behind every case file, behind every courtroom verdict, lies a human being whose laughter, dreams, and future were stolen in an instant. Thank you for watching this video. If this story moved you, please don't let it fade away. Like, share, and comment your thoughts. And please make sure to subscribe for more real-life true crime stories that uncover the darkness and honor those silenced by it.